Order, order. Nickie Aiken to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I am delighted to have secured this extremely important debate, repealing and replacing the Vagrancy Act 1824, and thank honourable members present for putting in to speak. I know from my mailbag that constituents, businesses and visitors to the cities of London and Westminster are concerned about rough sleepers and share my desire and that of the government to end rough sleeping for good. As the title suggests, this debate is not just about the repeal of the Vagrancy Act, but to consider what should replace it, to respond to the 21st century reasons why people often find themselves on the street. I believe the government shares my wish to see the Vagrancy Act repealed, following the response from my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, to my recent question in the House, where he confirmed his belief that the Act, and I quote, should be consigned to history. The Vagrancy Act is an antiquated piece of legislation. Originally introduced to deal with returning soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars, with no public services available, many ended up on the streets begging and sleeping rough. It is now used by police and councils to tackle the small minority of rough sleepers involved in persistent antisocial behaviour. Similarly, powers under the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014, including public space protection orders and criminal behaviour orders, are also increasingly used. Yes, we must challenge anyone involved in antisocial behaviour, but rather than criminalising a rough sleeper, I truly believe that the better outcome for both the individual and for society is to address the reasons why they are on the street in the first place and provide the necessary help and support they obviously need.
Mr Shannon, congratulations on bringing this forward to Westminster Hall for consideration. Does the Honourable Lady not agree that with over 50 housing and homeless organisations supporting scrapping the Vagrancy Act, I believe that the Minister and Government must consider alternatives and acknowledge that many of these charities work with people experiencing homelessness directly, and they see how it presently feels to end rough sleeping, but instead pushes people into worse positions, and their circumstances must be respected and considered. You can't ignore 50 housing and charitable organisations.
The honourable member is absolutely right, Mr Chairman, and as he said, I do not know a charity involved in rough sleeping and homelessness that does not agree that the Vagrancy Act should be repealed. And if we get this right, it will end the revolving door that too many rough sleepers currently experience, whereby they accept outreach help, are placed in accommodation, but too often find themselves back on the streets because of their underlying mental health or addictions that have not been tackled. Even on the coldest day of the year and during adverse weather conditions brought on by the likes of the beast of the East, a considerable number of people choose to ignore the no questions asked help of a hot meal and a roof over their head, whether it's from a local authority, a church, a community centre or a mosque. They are so fearful, mistrusting or often mentally unwell that they prefer to remain outside in below zero temperatures where they feel safest. There are over 400 beds available on any given night in Westminster alone for rough sleepers. However, we cannot just offer a bed. The accommodation available rarely comes with the vital health services required to help turn a person's life around and address often years, sometimes decades, of abuse, poor mental health and addiction. But there is a clear solution. Replace the Vagrancy Act with a new approach that places the preservation of life at its core through assertive outreach alongside social care and specialist medical support, all attached to the safety of a bed. We need the addiction counsellor, the psychiatric help, the medical support for those who have suffered after years of sleeping rough. Now, the government's Everyone In strategy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic saw an incredible 90% of rough sleepers accept accommodation, demonstrating that when central and local government work together, we can achieve impressive results. But what about the other 10%? Throughout the first lockdown, Westminster continued to see around 100 people refuse all help and remain on the street. I saw many of them myself, and they were clearly very ill with serious addiction and mental health problems. Having witnessed what I have, and having spoken to former rough sleepers, outreach workers and other experts, it is clear that if we are to end rough sleeping for good, then a fundamental shake-up of mental health services is required. Charities, including the Passage, Crisis and St Mungo's, have highlighted that outreach workers today find it near on impossible to secure mental health assessments for rough sleepers. Even when one has been secured, often the vital missing piece of the jigsaw is a specialist bed for that person. People on the street with the most complex needs often lack the mental health capacity to make decisions for their own well-being or to accept help from others. At present, a rough sleeper's mental state has to become so acute that he or she is self-harming or at risk of doing so, so that the police take emergency action, and only then they may have a mental health assessment. By that stage, it is far too late, hence why we need an assertive outreach approach. We need outreach workers working in partnership with specialist homelessness mental health teams who can undertake mental health assessments under the Mental Health Act, as well as other types of assessments, on the street, with rapid access to specialist bed spaces. We then need the health services required attached to the bed that the rough sleeper is then referred to. I would welcome the Minister addressing this point specifically and to consider reintroducing street-based mental health services. And of course, none of this could happen without the backing of long-term sustainable funding. And I ask the Government again today to give due consideration to extending the time period of funding allocations for such services to at least 3 years, preferably 5, rather than on the current annual basis. Mr. Chairman, as we slowly and carefully begin our journey out of the pandemic, much is in flux. However, we do now have a golden opportunity to build upon Everyone In, to learn from that initiative and to reshape our response so we have the services we need to achieve our shared goal of ending rough sleeping. The Government, I believe, is willing and able to end rough sleeping, repealing and replacing the Vagrancy Act, longer-term funding attached to mental health services, attached to accommodation, and re-establishing street-based mental health services will do that very thing. I look forward to the contributions of other members and the Minister's response.